kind of politics that is aimed at getting toward solutions, at resolving disputes, at finding a kind of common ground where you actually can move something forward. And it's also, I think, a link, as I suggested last week, to a number of the sermons that we've heard from our excellent clergy over the past several months. And I just, after today's sermon, made a note to add slow rhetoric to that. I said last week, if you all had great questions and brilliant suggestions, I would steal them shamelessly. I have stolen many of your things from my book I'm working on, your comments from last week. I think I'll also borrow that phrase from Father Bill about slow rhetoric, because I think that is a great way to think about how I understand this concept of moderation. The Federalists and Anti-Federalists, of course, in short, those who favored and opposed ratification of the Constitution, when they sort of reached the sticking point in 1787 and 88, and you've got, I think, reproduced in your packet there, a chart. I never leave home without that chart. As my wife Kathy will attest, I never stopped talking about that chart either. So she's heard numerous iterations of this. But this sort of captures, I think, the movement that had to take place in order to get the Constitution ratified. Because early on, the Federalists were very strongly insistent that the Constitution as written at Philadelphia is what needs to be ratified. No amendments, no additions, no changes. The Constitution at Philadelphia has to be ratified. The Anti-Federalists opposed that, not so much because they were against a new national government, but they thought the Constitution itself was too powerful. It gave too much power to a central government. It did not protect rights and individual liberties, and so they were very concerned and opposed to ratifying it. The Anti-Federalists would only go so far. The Federalists were not willing to reach out and meet them, and so in late 1787, you have essentially a polarized political environment, where the Federalists on one side are saying, take this or nothing, and the Anti-Federalists are saying, but we need a new government, but we don't want that one. We don't want the Constitution as it is without any changes. In Massachusetts in 1788, January of 1788, Federalists there, realizing they were probably not going to win ratification in the states, and of course, as you know, each of the states themselves had to have a convention to vote whether to ratify or not. Knowing they probably wouldn't get that achieved without some gesture to the Anti-Federalists, they suggested a new strategy that involved voting to ratify, but also listing and submitting prospective amendments, recommended amendments to the Constitution that would then be sent to the first new Congress in this government. And that first new Congress would then consider the amendments from all the states and then eventually put together a list of amendments and changes to make to the Constitution. That was an act of moderation, as we talked about last week. The extension of the offer of recommended amendments, the proposal of recommended amendments, that sort of unstuck the debate. It unstuck a debate that had become frozen or calcified. There are a lot of different words, and you all suggested last week some great words to describe that, some great metaphors to describe that. It made possible what I think is the key to this chart, which is the movement away from the two polar opposites toward the middle. And that movement is indicated in green here. And the movement also means that once that takes place, some of the Anti-Federalists who had been opposed to ratification, they move and say, well, I can vote for ratification with the idea and the possibility of adding recommended amendments. And Federalists who had been against even allowing that said, well, that's not such a crazy idea, and we're never going to get this ratified without that, so why don't we go ahead and reach out? The point, and I think what this chart captures, is that it takes a good faith effort on both sides to achieve moderation. It takes a seriousness of purpose and a dedication to a broader goal, in this case of creating a new governing system and mechanism for the United States, since the Articles of Confederation, even Anti-Federalists agreed, did not work anymore and were problematic. But it created a kind of possibility where both sides could be heard, they could hear each other, and I think the effort of reaching out, as we would say today, across the aisle is the phrase we often hear. In this case, in 1787 and 88, that's what Anti-Federalists and Federalists did. Creating this mechanism made for the movement, and it made it possible for the Massachusetts Convention, the Virginia and New York conventions later, all of which, if there had been no recommended amendments, most likely would have voted it down and voted against ratifying the Constitution. But with that possibility, several individuals moved toward that center position. And as you see, Federalists who had, in some cases initially had said, we'll never accept this. We don't want to weigh down the Constitution with a whole bunch of amendments right off the bat. It's going to spoil the system before it ever gets started. So with that kind of movement on both sides, it creates some flexibility. It creates a possibility of working together. And I argue, as I will do at length in this book I'm finishing this semester, I hope, it will create the opportunity for not just compromise, but for working together and seeing things in a different way. Moderation, and we'll talk about some of the characteristics of it today, but moderation, I think, in many ways, is sort of a practical way for practical people to work out a solution, to work out a way of moving forward, to deal with the problem, and to find constructive, creative ways to get there. Moderation, as I say here on the lecture notes, on the outlines, it created this movement in the ratification debate that was incredibly important. And of course, this chart, I think, hopefully sort of captures that movement. It captures where things had been a deeply polarized environment, and then it captures where they were able to move throughout 1788. And Massachusetts ratified, and then Maryland and South Carolina, and then New Hampshire and Virginia and New York, and eventually even Rhode Island and North Carolina. Most of those states wound up proposing recommended amendments. They all ended up eventually voting for ratification. So that chart is a very crude, hand-rendered map by me of what I see happening. And my challenge in the book, in fact, I have a note on my whiteboard at my office with this chart up there, and it says, a note to myself, because I tend to forget these important things, write the chart. And so what I'm going to try to do in this book is to explain how this happens and where it happens, and in other words, sort of spell out how moderation works and where it works. The last point I think I would make simply is that moderation in 1788, I think, can be seen as a radical political force. Now, I don't mean radical in the ideological sense, but radical in the sense that here's a debate that had become stuck, and moderation provided the means to open that up. It provided the means for movement and for resolution and for settlement. It made possible a ratification which had not been possible before and which may well have gone down to defeat without that. So to bring about the ratification unanimously by the states, that's a pretty radical development, I would suggest. And I think moderation is a large part of what made that possible. And I think once it got started, it created a momentum of its own, which built and built and built and became very powerful. So that is a sort of brief recap of what we talked about last week and sort of a brief introduction to this topic. And it prompts the next question, which is, what happened? Once they finally figured out this way of listening to each other, of being collaborative in the sense of talking and resolving politics and political disputes that way, when did it go wrong? When did moderation break down? And I think there are a couple of answers to that. In the short run, moderation, I think, fell apart because of the appearance of something that the founders in Philadelphia never imagined. Anyone know what that would have been? A room full of really smart people in Philadelphia in 1787 wrote a constitution that never took into account something that emerged within a couple of years of the new government. Political parties, exactly. What does the Constitution say about political parties? Nothing. Not anything else. Your silence answers that question. There's nothing in there about political parties. And yet they emerged very quickly because of different ways of thinking about government, but of course also, as we'll see, different ways of reading and interpreting the Constitution. Because even a seemingly simple phrase like necessary and proper, Congress has the right to pass all laws deemed necessary and proper, proved to be hugely combative because people said, well, what does necessary mean? And what does proper mean? And who gets to decide the meaning of necessary and proper and whether this counts or not? So those and all kinds of issues came up very quickly in the 1790s, as well as a dispute about whether to follow or be on good terms with Great Britain or with France in foreign policy, on how strong the national government should be compared to the state governments. All of these kinds of issues came up and divided people badly in the 1790s. And part of what led James Madison to join the opposition party to George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and the Federalists was the fact that he believed that his political opponents, led by Hamilton, were not respecting the moderation that they had practiced at the Philadelphia Convention or in the stat ratifying conventions that had made this movement possible. Now, the other document I never leave home without is Federalist 37. It's one of the Federalist Papers, not the most famous, but as I said last week, it kind of should be, because it says a lot in there about moderation, about the difficulty of creating new governments, the difficulty of governing in an audience where not everybody agrees, and so you have disagreement built in, yet you have to find some way to work together to address the nation's problems and to deal with issues that come up. Federalist 37, which I passed out to you last week, is an essay, I think, that really captures how Madison thought politics should work. And it was very much, for Madison, a collaborative process where nobody could insist on their way or the highway, where nobody could say, we'll never do that, we don't even want to talk about it. Federalist 37, I think, was crucial to understanding how Madison thought about the Constitution and also about politics. And since Madison had a very long life and career, he lived until 1836, he's actually technically maybe one of the last of the founders in terms of surviving and living that long. And of course, he was involved in Congress, he was Secretary of State, he was president for 2 terms, and he wrote and spoke widely about politics and political matters. Brief aside, historians often argue about whether or not there is a James Madison problem, because seemingly the James Madison of the 1780s, of this time period, is someone who's a strong Federalist, a strong nationalist, believes in a powerful central government, wants to sort of render the states less powerful than before. And yet then in the 1790s, as a Jeffersonian, Madison seems to revert to favoring state power over national power. He seems to reject the Hamiltonian system, the national bank, and all those kinds of things. He favors a foreign policy that's sympathetic to France rather than a foreign policy sympathetic to the British. And so Madison seemingly is a nationalist in the 1780s and more of a states' rights person in the 1790s. And so historians have often argued, well, this is a problem. We have to explain James Madison. How do we explain that conversion? How does he move from one to the other? How does he go from being, we might say, a Hamiltonian to a Jeffersonian? And as you probably guessed by now, my modest contribution to that debate would be to suggest that Federalist 37 is a way out of that dilemma. If we think about 37, where he talks about the difficulty of governing, the difficulty that the constitutional founders faced in Philadelphia, the need for compromise, the need for listening, the need for reaching out, the unavailability of dictating to others what you're going to do all the time, if that is his template for how politics should work, if that's his ideal for how politics should work, then I think we don't need to see Madison as going from nationalist to states' rights or anything of the sort. I think we can instead understand that Madison became disillusioned with the way the political system was working in the 1790s. The parties polarized the nation. The parties moved people to this side or that side. They broke up friendships. They broke up connections. They made people to argue and dispute all the time, to use, in Father Bill's phrase this morning, fast rhetoric and not the slow rhetoric of the ratification debate here. They were at each other's throats in that time. Madison, I think, had more than a party affiliation. I think he had an ideal way of how politics should work and how politics could best function, and in fact had to function under the constitutional system. And so again, if you got Federalist 37 from last week's handouts, or you want to Google that at some point, I think it's a good read, and I think it may in fact suggest how Madison thought about politics at this time period. So in the short run, I think moderation fell apart simply because of the political parties and the intense polarization which reintroduced the polarization before moderation had worked during ratification. That's the short run. In the long run, I think moderation began to fall apart in the U.S. in the early 19th century simply because governing the nation, which was expanding geographically, growing in terms of population, and expanding in terms of the numbers of issues that became governing controversies, simply became a much more difficult place to govern than the nation of the 13 states of the 1780s and 90s. As the country began to go westward, every time a new state came into the Union, the question had to be answered, will this be a state that tolerates slavery or outlaws slavery? And so what kinds of people will move to that state? Will enslaved peoples and the concept of slavery be protected there or not? Those were issues that led to conflicts and controversies as well. And of course, that battle over slavery and anti-slavery was not the only issue that they were fighting over, but it was certainly a key one. And it was one of the issues that led to multiple compromises during the 19th century. Henry Clay is often called the Great Compromiser, Senator, Speaker of the House from Kentucky, three-time loser of the presidential election. But Clay was nonetheless one of the most important figures of the day because he played such a key role in guiding compromises through Congress. Now, Clay was, in some ways, practiced moderation, certainly, in order to bring people together and try to find some ways to resolve these issues. But all of those compromises led to the continuation of slavery, the expansion of slavery into new Western areas, which infuriated many anti-slavery Northerners, created an intense passion to further that pursuit on the part of Southern political figures. As we know, it all culminated in a civil war after the last of those compromises, the Compromise of 1850, had finally broken down. So in a sense, moderation, which is always difficult to practice, became loaded down with the party conflict. It became loaded down with all these questions of expansion and growth and westward movement. And it became the sort of issue, the sort of practice that became fleeting in American politics. And of course, as we know, and as we'll talk a little bit more later, parties, divisions, polarization, intense arguments, have they gone away? They have not. I'll answer my own question. And of course, the persistence of those problems, I think, doesn't rule out the possibility of moderation, but it makes the need for it even greater. And of course, sometimes when the need is great, hopefully people step forward and fill in by supplying moderation. But when they do not, then we often are left with this fractured political world and fractured political scene. What I want to do a little bit today, since we have talked about the rise of moderation during the time period of ratification, the challenges to moderation and the ultimate sort of collapse of it in the early republic, I think we might sort of take several steps back and ask, well, okay, moderation works for a time, then it breaks down. But what exactly is it? What are the characteristics of moderation? When we talk about that, when we say that, when we think about that historically, what does moderation mean and what did it mean? You have in your packet a couple of lists, actually, of topics and themes. One is called the Decalogue of Moderation, from a scholar named Aurélien Crayutu, who studies primarily European politics, French politics, and others, but has developed, I think, he's probably one of the foremost scholars today, certainly, of political moderation. Crayutu has developed a 10-point decalogue, as he calls it, of key characteristics of moderation. I'd like to just go through these. I won't talk about every one of them necessarily, but let me put a little flesh on what's a very short handout here. Do not assume that moderation has only one face, Crayutu says. Moderation speaks to the middle of a political dispute or spectrum. It also is an antidote to fanaticism and political fervor or zealotry. It is also a form of civility. It is a performance of temperance in political debates. And it also wears the face sometimes of a disposition to compromise. So in other words, moderation wears many faces. It looks differently in different contexts. It can take on many different forms. Number two, he says, try to understand why some people are temperamentally inclined to moderation while others are not. Now, the practice of moderation in terms of compromise may be available to most everyone at various times, but there certainly are leaders in politics who are prone to or against moderation. And sometimes, as he suggests, moderation can come about through temperament of political leaders, sometimes through fear of what's happening in the world around them, sometimes through necessity, in the sense that nothing else is going to get us through our present problem. And moderation also can be about a principle as well. But in short, all of these suggest that moderation is not a gift that everyone possesses. And even for those who do possess the moderate temperament, they don't possess it equally, which means that it's always going to be sort of a difficult thing to pin down and a difficult thing to gain access to for many people. Third, he writes, pay special attention to the constitutional elements of moderation. There are in constitutions, he argues, a lot of elements that build in a kind of moderation. And he uses, as he talks about here and in the next couple of examples as well, the concept of different branches of government, of a mixed constitution, whether it's between a king and parliament, whether it's between president and Congress, whether it's between a balance of powers in our system between executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Those are places or examples of where constitutionalism actually can contain examples of moderation, and that in many cases there is not just a temperament or a mindset, as I've talked about, but there are ways in which you can build a system, much like the 1787 Constitution did, that bakes into that mix several of the principles of moderation. I'll just talk about a few more here because I don't want to spend too much time on this, but again, as we said, balance of powers, mixed governments, these kinds of things. Other points he mentions, number 5, moderates don't lack political vision. It's often tempting to dismiss moderates as, well, they're just sort of mushy and it's, I don't know, this way or that way, it doesn't really matter, just give me whatever is fine. He suggests that moderates, in fact, do have political visions, that moderates often are the ones who can have a vision to chart us out of whatever dilemma we're in. 1788, without moderates on both sides having the vision to say we're never going to get this Constitution ratified unless we make some change, unless we do something, create a possibility to listen and consider a wide array of views and let people change some minds as a result, that's a form of vision. That's an expression of political vision. And I think what Craiutu would remind us is whether we're talking about European politics, American politics, that vision is part of what moderates have and share. There's a lot to be said, he also says, for simply keeping the ship of state on an even keel. I'm not a sailor. Many of you may sail yourselves, but there's quite a bit where he talks about trimming and adjusting the sails and keeping the ship on an even course and preserving a kind of balance. And just as you're trying to get a ship across a body of water, or you're trying to get a government through a difficult time period, he thinks there's an awful lot to be said for this concept of preserving balance, and that moderates can play a great role in doing that. If one side is dominating power or dominating the other, then it might be time to sort of work on the side that's weaker and give some support to them as a means of balancing things so that things are in a greater equilibrium. So there's not a dominance by this party or a dominance by that party, but rather the two are, if not equal, at least close to each other. So there's a possibility of exchange where each party needs the other in some ways to move things forward. That is part of the great advantage, he suggests, of moderation. And just a couple more words that I think sum up a lot of this. And again, in fact, I've given you the names of 2 of his books on the reading list. If you'd like to read more about this, he's certainly got those books, and this is available. But I think one of the other great attributes of moderation, according to Craiutu, and I certainly see that in my work on the ratification, is moderation is really extremely flexible. The flexibility, the ability to wear different faces, to take different guises, to understand that in different moments a different move or a different maneuver is necessary, that's really critical. Moderates are able to sort of look at a situation where one side says this or nothing, and the other side says this or nothing, and moderates are able to say, well, you know, what if we were to look at this differently? There's got to be some flexibility. There's got to be some give here. If you get that and you get that and we can work this together, or maybe that goal can be achieved by these tactics over here, all of those, I think, provide ways in which he suggests that the flexibility is really critical. And I just want to read one passage briefly from his work that I think sums up the constitutional debate very nicely. The example suggests that moderates may sometimes benefit from partisanship and polarization, insofar as the exposure to the crossfire of radicals can stimulate their imagination by encouraging them to develop original political and institutional responses to their problems. So polarization we think of as a bad thing, and it often is, but he suggests that it's in that messiness, that badness, if you will, that moderates can seize the opportunity, and they can come up with a creative solution, a creative way to get around that. Because of the crossfire, because of the conflict, it often can stimulate creative political thinking. And that creative political act in 1787-88 was the idea of voting to ratify the Constitution, but allowing the delegates to propose recommended amendments so that the concerns they had with the Constitution would be addressed by the first new Congress, and that would be a way of being heard, of being seen, of getting their message out there. That was a creative political thought. Because we might say, well, why didn't they just think about that in Philadelphia? But it took, again, arguably the crossfire of this incredibly intense conflict to provoke that kind of thinking that led to a creative political solution to that. So that is some of what I think makes moderation a key principle in terms of what Aurelia and Craiutu writes about. Now, what about moderation in American politics? This has also had a number of students, and a very good one is a man named Robert Calhoun, who taught for years, I think, at East Carolina University, if I recall correctly. He sort of boiled it down. Craiutu's got 10 concepts, I guess because he's dealing with all of European politics, but Calhoun's got 4 key strands for moderation in U.S. politics. And I think these are fairly straightforward, but just we can maybe mention these as well. It's a respect for both principle and prudence as being linked together, that we need to do certain things. We're trying to work toward principles, but prudence is a political virtue, as Aristotle wrote, and this is something that's critical to getting things done and succeeding in politics. Moderation, he notes also, was a cluster of insights into the nature of political conflict and the duties, and I think this is key, of conscientious members of society. Now, not everyone is a conscientious member of society. Not all political actors are conscientious political actors. But those who are, those are the ones who can really sort of meet the moment in terms of coming up with a conscientious way of dealing with problems so that people feel seen and heard, so that there's a possibility for input and change and moderation. He also notes that in American political life, at moments of intense division, many have recognized that it's actually good politics, and may have known in their souls, he writes, that even when moderation cost them politically, that it was still the right thing to do. And we can probably find moments in the past, certainly, where someone has made a courageous political stand that brought about a compromise that may have alienated their base, as it were, or alienated their rivals, or seemed to be confusing or out of step with what they were doing. But it was the right thing to do in terms of moving a debate or moving a solution along. And I think, again, in terms of the constitutional debate and others, the last comment, number 4 there from Calhoun, I think is key. Political moderation did not arise from a subsidence of conflict, but was rather, and I love this phrase, a response mechanism within American political culture to manifestly destructive levels of partisanship and polarization. A response mechanism to manifestly destructive levels of partisanship and polarization. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that that was the situation the country faced in 1787 and 88. Manifestly destructive levels of partisanship and polarization. The fear was the Constitution might get voted down. You might have several separate confederacies instead of one union. Those confederacies would be weak. They would be inviting to European powers to come take over, and the entire American revolutionary experiment would be lost. That's a moment of potential political crisis, and I think the destructive levels at the time of the ratification debate prompted this work in moderation that helped find a way out, find a way through, find a way to deal with those things. Now, if that's where we have been, the last part of my talk today, which will soon open up for your comments and discussion and questions, I call it simply no moderation, no compromise, no civility, and ask the question, why has moderation in the 21st century disappeared when we need it most? And I have given you on the last pages of this handout a sampling of books, sort of titles and authors, and a brief synopsis of these. I took one for the team. I read all these books so you wouldn't have to. And I've summarized them for you here. So you can sort of throw out these titles and think, oh yeah, so-and-so says, and Rosenfeld argued, and this and that. Actually, no, this is a room of smart, serious, thoughtful people. You've probably read some of these books, or others like them. If not, I urge you to do so. And if you do get a chance to, write to me. Let me know what you think of these. They sort of are all addressing the themes of contemporary politics in many ways. The first couple of first couple of titles there, are simply the Craiutu and Calhoun books that I was quoting from previously. There are a couple of other books about early American politics that relate to the debate over the Constitution. Caitlin Carter has a great recent book on the topic of democracy and secrecy. Secrecy and transparency in the age of revolutions. And she makes the point that both the American and the French revolutions celebrated openness and transparency. But in fact, the governance created by those found that doing things out in the open was difficult, that trying to have a congressional meeting with everybody yelling from the galleries and things like that was not particularly constructive. And so she charts the way in which both in the United States and in France, governments that had first advocated openness and transparency and condemned secrecy actually sometimes found that, well, meeting in secret is productive. The Constitutional Convention met in secret at Philadelphia. Now, obviously, they knew whatever they produced would have to be sent out to the people and to the states, and so they would never keep it secret forever. But that was, again, an example of meeting in secret. The state ratified conventions actually were the opposite. They were open to the public. And in fact, the Massachusetts Convention had to go to 3 or 4 different sites to find a place big enough for all the convention delegates, who were numerous, and for all the people who wanted to watch from the galleries and listen to the debates and see what was there. So I think that's a really interesting book about those concepts of democracy and secrecy. Another one by Jordan Taylor, a recent book, is wonderfully titled Misinformation Nation, Foreign News and the Politics of Truth. And as I say in my summary, fake news and disinformation are nothing new. Back during the Revolutionary era, the news people got, and I guess I should put this scare quotes up there, the news people got was often fake. It was deliberately constructed. It was a lie to sort of move people in a certain direction, or it was out of context, or missing key details, or it was incomplete. And so the news that led people to make decisions about voting for or against independence, or about voting for or against certain kinds of concepts or actions during the war, was often based on information. Now, not all of that was deliberate. Some of it was simply, it took 6 weeks or so to get news from Europe or from England across to the United States. It took 6 weeks for news to go back across. And as everybody is reacting to what's happening and what's being done, they're often getting partial information, misinformation, sometimes intentional disinformation. And so that concept of disinformation and misinformation has been around for a long time. And Jordan Taylor, I think, really interestingly talks about that concept from the Revolutionary era through the early Republic, almost up to the American Civil War. So that's, again, I think, a nice piece of historical grounding for our present moment. When we think that this is all brand new, this has never happened before, in fact, it has. And I think Taylor's book does a great job of that. The rest of these books, I hope, and I believe, give us some good ways of thinking about our present moment and present moments. They help us, I think, understand why our politics today is so fractured and divided and so bitter and so unsatisfying to many of us. I think they help explain why when people tell pollsters what they want or how they think about issues, there's often no connection between those preferences and the laws that get passed in Congress or the actions or positions that people take. And I think the books I've listed here, they come from a variety of perspectives. They take a lot of different viewpoints, but I think they're all really important works for helping us think about how we got to where we are today, and perhaps how we might get away from those or get away from that as well. I'll just highlight a few of these. Again, I've given you synopses here, and again, I encourage everybody to read these books. If you read them and you see them differently or you think differently than I do about them, write to me. I'd be happy to have in true moderate form, I'd be happy to have a conversation. Happy to sit down or do it on email or meet after church someday and talk through these things sometimes. But I think a lot of these are really important books. I'll just highlight a few of them. Nicole Hemmer has a book called Partisans that really sort of looks at what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years of politics. I was talking with someone about this after our session last week, how it seemed like we've been in a really nasty phase of politics for a long time now, and there hasn't been an interruption. There really hasn't been a break to that. And Hemmer traces that to the rise of talk radio, the rise of partisan news programs, the cultivation of anger and fear on an ongoing basis, the anti-incumbent spirit, which is always, both parties will do this. Well, everything is terrible, blame the people in power and replace them with our side. And then 2 years later, everything is terrible, replace them again and put us back in power. She suggests that this is how we understand what she calls pitchfork politics. She traces this back to people like Pat Buchanan in his campaign against George H.W. Bush in 1992, the rise of Rush Limbaugh and talk radio and these kinds of things. So it's much more of a longer term understanding that sort of suggests that today's problems didn't just happen in 2016 or 2020, that they've been building for a while, and that's one of the ways. The books by Thomas Frank and Lily Geismer, I think, are very important because they suggest that as Democrats have tried to embrace neoliberalism and market policies and things like this, they have won votes and often won votes away from Republicans, but they have also sort of begun to abandon the voices and the concerns of the working class. And I think the early results we're getting of this last election suggest that that's a huge factor in how the election turned out the way that it did. It's been a long-standing problem, as Frank and Geismer points out, that the need to win approval from Wall Street and campaign donations from Wall Street has made the Democrats often very successful politically, but has often sort of robbed what used to be the core of the Democratic Party message, dating back to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And I think that suggests how Democrats have in part contributed to this, this system as well. The Sam Rosenfeld book, I think, is just fascinating because in the 1950s, so this falls under the heading of Be Careful What You Wish For. In the 1950s, Democrats decided that it was really frustrating. Progressive Democrats from the northern cities said it was really frustrating to have to deal with Southern segregationists on every issue and compromise and work out some sort of deal with people who promoted segregation and all these terrible things. And Republicans thought it would be great if they could have a conservative party that didn't have Nelson Rockefeller and people like that in it, that didn't have liberal Republicans challenging them and pushing them and pulling them in the other direction. And political scientists thought it would be great to have a liberal party and a conservative party. And that's pretty much how Democrats and Republicans remade themselves in the 1950s and afterwards. The Democrats became a liberal party, pushing Southern segregationists out or to the back. They migrated to the Republican Party. Republicans, of course, pushed their liberal wing out of view as well. The Rockefellers, the Lowell Weickers, even George H.W. Bush faced a rebellion from Pat Buchanan and people like that in his Republican Party. So this, I think, is a book that suggests today's polarization didn't just happen. It wasn't just an accident. It actually was intentional. And there are a lot of factors that contributed to it. But it suggests, I think, that the way politics is today, good or bad, right or wrong, however we think about it, whichever side we might be on, this had its roots in some conscious decision-making in the 1950s and 60s to do just that. And just a couple more here. The Hacker and Pearson books, another great title, Let Them Eat Tweets. You probably can guess who that refers to, a certain political leader who always communicates in all caps tweets, it seems. It really sort of looks at this issue of how Republicans have been able to practice what he calls, and this is a great phrase, plutocratic populism. Plutocratic populism. That is, pursuing policies that will benefit one segment of society while to gate votes popularizing other issues. So tax cuts, deregulation for a certain set of their followers while bringing up cultural issues about bathrooms and about churches and about all kinds of other divisive issues to stir people up, about immigrants eating dogs and things like this. All that, they suggest, is part of what has happened as the Republican Party has developed in the last several decades. Again, sort of how the right rules in an age of extreme inequality. And many of the books, again, talk about Democrats and their complicity in that rise of inequality as well. Lastly, and this is the one book on the list I haven't finished yet. I've read enough of it to know where it's going. So again, if you'd like to read this with me, we could do a virtual reading group or something maybe somehow, and you could read it together collectively all on our own and eventually maybe come and talk about it. It's the last book called The Hollow Parties, which I think is a very important one, The Hollow Parties, suggesting that the Democratic Party is a sort of collection of interest groups and pursues group interest. And they have conflicting voices and conflicting actors, and in any given election, one voice is stronger than others, or some segments are stronger than others. And so we have this great collision of conflicting actors that have hollowed out the party by trying to make it a single issue group or a single issue movement. And on the Republican side, Republicans have been led and hollowed out as a party that, again, used to be a big tent that spoke to many views and many voices. Republicans have been hollowed out by what they call committed actors, people who are committed to a certain set of policies, a certain way of governing, a certain way of seeing the world, no room for compromise, no need for compromise, no need for working across the aisle, just simply a pursuit of those policies. As I said, I haven't finished the book yet, so I don't feel competent to speak to, I know what they argue, but I need to go through and read it and see what the evidence is and how they treat that and how they do that. So I offer these books again as because again, as professors, we're temperamentally incapable of not saying, oh, here's a list of things you should go read. So here's a list of things you should go read. I do think, though, for the themes we've been talking about, whether it is grace and politics, whether it is moderation in politics, whether it is fast rhetoric and slow rhetoric, I think on all these matters, these books have some things to say to us. And I think they can help us understand, again, how we have gotten to where we are presently, and perhaps maybe some ways that we can work out of those as well. Now, lastly, you may have noticed, as I have, that our clergy often end their sermons not with a definitive statement, but with a question. A question that says, how does this look for us? Or how will we treat this issue? Or what will our leap of faith be? Those kinds of questions, as a way for us to think about the readings we've had and the message of the sermon as we take that into our lives and into our weeks ahead and what we do every day. And so I'd like to end today not with a definitive statement, but with a question. What conditions do we think might be necessary for moderation to have a chance to make a comeback? How might we restore moderation? What do we think of as the vital conditions, the preconditions, the necessary elements, the things we have to get to create the possibilities for moderation, which again seems to be in short supply in recent years. And I offer the debate over the Constitution at our founding moment as an example of a time when moderation was practiced and when it worked to deliver an incredibly important development that has created the Constitution that we have been living under from that time forward. So with that, I open up the floor for questions.
We take a
comments,
moment
and
to thank Dr. Estes for that wonderful
Thank you.
presentation, really masterful. I'm going to start over on this side of the room. Amy.
Thank you very much. At the risk of using short rhetoric, which I am, because I haven't had time to really mull over all of this, when you asked that question at the end, the thing that was so glaring to me is we just go back to having all white men in charge. Because as I think about being a moderate, where is the line? You know, if I were to be more moderate, I would be definitely putting at risk the rights of minorities, of women, of children. And so that was the quick answer. I mean, to me, that's, and I don't agree with white men being in charge, but that's what it looks like.
Well, I just want to say You know, fast rhetoric is not always bad. I mean, I just want to point out, it's good to ask, and in this
There you
thing,
go.
yeah, this, yeah, so I'm going to just let's let Todd react to that, and I'll go back here. I think I saw this hand.
Well, I thank you very much for that comment, because it does remind us that the early republic was a very different world. It was a world where white men ruled. No, I mean, exactly right. It was, in part, this was as difficult as it was. Imagine how much more difficult it would have been if there were more voices, more voters, more people, more constituencies and interests. So I take your point. It's a very, very good one.
Because that, at the time, was far less than half of the population, far less, and I don't know the exact number, even had the ability to have a voice. And so now, when you said, well, how is it different now? That's a major difference. And there's been a power loss in that group of white men. And so with that loss, and we see that when they were saying young white male voters were what made a significant difference in this last election. And I just wonder how you would recommend women and minorities and immigrants and those who feel, who are, in some cases, for women, don't even have equal medical care. How are we supposed, is there ever a line? You know, and what's the difference between peacekeeping and being a moderate?
Yeah.
We have a couple, do you want to, I do want to,
No,
I want
take
to,
more
Mike,
questions,
I want to have a couple more people say something on this end,
sure.
and then we'll jump in.
Let's have a quick comment. I think conditions right now are really ripe for moderation. And just having gone through this political period we just did, and in all due respect to our latest comment, I'm weary of our identity separation. We're all God's children. And I think we need to start thinking that way, and possibly it begins with our churches.
And then another,
Yeah, just a quick question. Historically, we're looking at a two-party system. Recently, I mean, it's probably been happening longer, there are groups of people trying to establish a more moderate party. And is that an opportunity that you see as viable, or how would they wield the influence of moderation?
and then one more. It's someone you know.
Yeah, so this is a totally different direction, and I'm sorry I didn't
It's a
think to
plant,
ask you this
yeah.
at home.
Yes.
But
My
when I
wife,
think-
Kathy.
When I think about the language of the founding, I'm always struck by how much we have images of family. You know, we have the founding fathers who used to be the sons of liberty, and then they went and married the daughters of the American Revolution after they broke away from Mother England, right? And even when we think about the Civil War, it's brother against brother, and even within slavery, we have this image of, or the reference to aunts and uncles as a way to create a myth that sort of justifies the injustice. But my question is, to what extent is that metaphor like legitimate, and how much was that just wishful thinking? How much was that trying to sort of impose a sense of destiny and community by using the language of family? And does that offer us anything to think about today?
I think that's a goodly amount of things, yes, don't you think?
Yeah, that's-
And I want to go, Amy, I'm sorry I thought you were done, and I just want to make sure, yeah.
Yeah, these are great. These questions are actually, they're too good. You've done too good a job of listening and thinking about these, because these are all great things to mention. Let me just say a couple of things briefly, because I know other people want to speak as well. Craiutu, who gave us the Decalogue of Moderation, he suggested that a party that's called the centrist party, he didn't think would work, because, again, he places so much emphasis on how centrists need these rival wings to spark that kind of creativity and the flexibility. That a centrist party that simply says, well, you know, we're in the middle of whatever the two sides are, permanently, that sort of robs them of the flexibility and robs them of the spontaneity that sort of makes moderation possible in that way. So as a party basis, it seems like, and the successful third parties, at least for a brief time in American politics, have typically been those parties that were very intensely dedicated to a single goal. It might be anti-slavery, or it could be workers' rights, or it could be coining silver instead of gold, those kinds of things. They're really focused, really adamant about pursuing those goals. And a party that's sort of dedicated to, well, we're just kind of, middling, we're sort of in the middle, Craiutu at least thinks that wouldn't work very well functionally. Language of politics and language of family in politics, I think in many ways, it's a great question, a great point. I think at this time, given as I mentioned, the smaller size of the country, the fewer states that were involved, made it easier to conceive of the nation as a family. But even when people like John Jay spoke of a family, they were thinking about people like them. In this case, not just other white men, but other white families. And certainly over time, the concept and the definition of what is a family and how do families function and how do families work and what is aspirationally, what should families be? And are there multiple ways of having families and experiences families? And of course there are, and I think that has led to the problem of this language in politics. Because again, I think we would all agree that it's great to think of ourselves as a family, as a nation. The nation is a family. It's great to think in those terms. It's great to think that whatever divides us, there are those things that are much larger and bigger. But again, that gets harder. And again, this week, as we heard in the sermon today from Father Bill, at Thanksgiving, we probably all need those cards, right? We need those cards about how to start conversations or how to redirect conversations, because we'll be reminded that even literally in the same family, we have people who do not agree on the most fundamental kinds of things. And so I think as the nation has become larger, expanded, more diverse, more conflicted, as it's had more history, which has been divided and divided us in different camps or different groups over time, I think all that makes sustaining the family metaphor a lot harder to do.
Hi, given what you just said about the centrist party, one of the things that I've been thinking is to possibly get more involved in my local, I lean Democratic, so it would be my local Democratic club, but I tend to be more of a moderate myself, and if we all who were interested in changing the trajectory of our politics got involved, is that, what are your thoughts on that in terms of changing, at least, if we could start at the grassroots to get these parties to get back toward the center?
I think that's the only way that party change has really ever happened, is at the grassroots level. That sort of building, it doesn't come top down until it comes bottom up first, we might say. And I think that ability to sort of change things and work for change at our local level is really critical, because that has historically been the way parties have been nudged toward or away from certain positions, the way they have worked toward or away from certain kinds of issue stands. So I think I would encourage you to do that. It's a very important kind of work to do. And I think it also plays up what we talked about before with this book, The Polarizers. You're swimming upstream in trying to do that, because moderate voices in both parties tend to get squeezed out. And the idea of having a big tent party where you have both, say, Barry Goldwater and Nelson Rockefeller in the same Republican Party, that's hard to duplicate today. That's Rockefeller would almost certainly be a Democrat in many ways because of where the Republican Party has gone in ways that he was horrified by. But the same thing works the other way as well, whether it's Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema or people like that, or other traditionally conservative Democrats, many of whom became Republicans over time. That was in part because they were pushed away. So I think the polarization of both parties has made that what you're talking about much more difficult. And yet what you're talking about is the only way that we got this. The anti-federalist who said, well, I'll listen to the Federalist, or the Federalist who said, well, I'll listen to the anti-federalist, had there not been that segment of party moderates, we might say, this would never have happened. The movement toward the green would never have taken place. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why it's not today.
So we're gonna have three. We're gonna have Donovan, then Ron, then Tom. Donovan.
So how in today's world, how would we stop media bias and censorship?
And then next
Okay.
question, Ron. Let's just have it for the young people, right?
Yes.
Eyes on the prize.
Am I in that group of young people?
Yes, you too, Ron, yes. The hope of the future.
So I was at a lecture this Tuesday, and one of the themes of the lecture fit into your theme very well. And he said that the organizers of the Constitution were silent on the theory of sovereignty as a means to get the Constitution passed, state sovereignty versus federal sovereignty. And it sort of fits into your theory of, or your metaphor of family with matriarch and patriarch. What are your thoughts in terms of sovereignty and what type of challenges that creates going forward?
And
Okay.
then Tom, we're going to go three, and then I'll move over this side. I know people want to-
Among historians, is there any consensus about Bill Clinton's role as a moderate and creating a third way? At the time, in the 1990s, a lot of people saw Bill Clinton as he had a way of constructing third ways, was the term they used at the time.
My goodness, these are such excellent questions. First of all, I need 6 more sessions, I think, to get to this. So keep your calendars free, because we need to keep doing this. No, great questions. Question of media bias. This is, bias looks different to different people, I think. And some people on the left will see something and say, well, that's biased, whereas the right will say exactly the same thing. So I think agreeing on what that is the first step in sort of defining that, and trying to some degree, probably use truth as a way of gathering that. Are there things that are clearly true and clearly untrue? That could be, I guess, a starting point for that. And if news organizations are all consistently dedicated to pursuing truth, even when truth is debated in some ways, but presenting what those arguments are and what is actually incontrovertibly true, that may be a way to do that. The question again, and it's a great question, I thank you for that, about free speech and these kinds of things, that ties in as well. Because again, we do have a First Amendment right, constitutionally protected right to free speech. That is, of course, a term that has been understood and interpreted differently over time. And it remains, I think we all agree, a core concept. I mean, what are we without that ability to have freedom of speech? But again, does free speech mean absolutely all speech is protected? Or are there some kinds of speech that have to be shut down to promote civility, or need to be shut down to prevent violence, or those kinds of things? I don't think anybody has the answers to those things, but you're exactly on the right track. And I think that question, the way you framed it and phrased it, is really nicely done, because I think you made the connection between speech and public debates and the question of media bias, which one person's media bias is somebody else's free speech. I think it a lot depends on where our feet are in terms of this side of the aisle or that, as to how we might do that. State sovereignty question is a really good one. One of the things, and I would, again, for everybody, recommend a book I put on last week's reading list. I mean, I seriously do this every single time I talk, is hand out reading lists. There's a book there by Jonathan Gannap called Second Creation. And he makes the case there that when the Constitution was first written in Philadelphia and ratified by the states, nobody could have known what it actually meant, because it hadn't ever been used. It hadn't ever been tried. And not until Americans became, in Jonathan's great phrase, constitutional users. That is, they took the document and said, well, here it is, let's see if we can govern with it. Until they did that, then they began to sort of create the Constitution for real, we might say, in the 1790s, because it's a piece of paper. And people talked about sovereignty. It meant one thing to the anti-federalist. It meant something else to the federalist. Federalists wanted the sovereignty of the national government preeminent, the states much weaker. Anti-federalists flipped that. And those questions of sovereignty were not so much because they didn't know what they were talking about, but they sort of assumed that everybody saw things in a particular way. And until they began to govern in the 1790s and had to make those choices, that's when they actually created the meaning of the Constitution. That's when the debates came up over things like, what does the necessary and proper clause mean? What does the general welfare clause mean? All these kinds of things, as well as the debates over state power versus federal power, those didn't really come until the 1790s. And so you have the initial creation of the Constitution, 87 and 88, and then you have the second creation during the 1790s, as the parties are battling over it, as they're arguing over these terms and principles. And,
So was
Well, the Marshall Supreme Court was an intervention to try to say, let's shut this down and declare it a certain way. I mean, Marshall was hugely significant, not just because of judicial review, which is the concept that John Marshall's always identified with, but because Marshall tried to impose a reading of the Constitution favoring the sort of consolidated Federalist viewpoint and say, it's always been this way. It's always meant to be this way. It could always only be this way. And so Marshall tried to sort of, what's the word when you go back in time and retroactively, tried to retroactively say, oh, the founders meant this, and it happens to be exactly what I think of today. So that's part of that too. The last question from Tom was about Bill Clinton's third way. Yeah, I think I mentioned this to Kathy the other day. We were talking about Bill Clinton, and I made the point that Clinton's move toward the center to try to find this third way was incredibly important to make Democrats a viable political party again. Because remember, Jimmy Carter won 6 states against Ronald Reagan in 1980. Walter Mondale carried 1 state against Ronald Reagan in 1984. Michael Dukakis carried 10 states against H.W. Bush in 88. That's not competitive politics. And what Clinton was able to do is to sort of refashion, form this third way, a more market-friendly way, something that downplayed cultural politics. And Clinton carried in 1992 32 states for the Democrats, and then 31 when he ran for re-election in 96. That's a massively successful political revolution. But when we think about questions like inequality, actual policies that sort of hollowed out the working class, the trade agreements, the partnerships, what was it called, NAFTA was the big trade policy of the 1990s. Those things really sort of reshaped what was happening on the ground. And so I think historians now see that third wave as being really kind of destructive in a lot of ways. One more book to recommend. I've got to stop doing this. There's, I think it's by Gary Gerstle, Gerstle. And I think it's called something like the Rise and Fall of Neoliberalism, I believe is the title. It's something like that. But if you just look up Gerstle, it's his most recent book. I can see it on my shelf. I can't see the title clearly. But it's a very good book that sort of looks at that. And it's very good on Clinton. And there's another one, even more recent one, that's by 2 people. That's called, I think it's called something like The Clinton Failure. And it's not about, I mean, he's obviously hugely successful politically, but it's the Clinton failure in terms of what it means primarily for the labor movement and for working class people more generally. And if you will email me, again, I know where it is on my shelf. I look at it every day, or at least pass by it. I just can't pull up a title. I'll blame age for that.
We have David and Nancy and Jeff and Troy.
I'd like your reaction to this observation. For moderation to be more than a consequence of the extremes, it needs passion and passionate leaders. I don't know many passionate moderates. What do you think about that?
Okay?
All right, Nancy?
When we speak about inequality, and I hear my grandma's voice, patience, meek, and mild. Inequality, there are no women on the diagram. Mm-hmm. And how much they contributed, and the suffragettes, the inequality of women not being able to vote or have a voice in government. Just a little on women's history.
Okay.
And Nancy and I discussed this last week. The other thing she wanted to maybe lift up, if it's okay if I say a bit more, is also obviously standing behind all of this activity, there were women who are maintaining the informal networks. Mm-hmm. that study. And so if you could trace that history as well. Okay. And then Jeff?
You know, just there were 3 Republicans who kept on coming to mind as you've spoken. One is Barry Goldwater, picking up what perhaps someone just alluded to here earlier. Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, mm-hmm. and how that has come to rule in so many ways. The second Republican coming to mind, Floyd McKissick, who in 1969 was in the Nixon administration, wrote a book called 3/5 of a Man. alluding to the settlement in the Constitution as to how black votes would be counted. Every black person, black male, would be deemed 3/5 of a vote. And then finally, Newt Gingrich in the early 1990s, during the Contract America time, came to Detroit, gave a talk in which he boasted how when he came to Washington, Democrats and Republicans were socializing together, they were going to each other's bar mitzvahs, christenings, they were doing all this stuff, and he said, I brought an end to that immediately. And I...
Oh, please, sorry.
No, in any event, thinking those three individuals come to mind in statements they made in the course of their own political careers. So,
And then Dr. Doster.
Oh, yes.
This, this is more of an observation than a question. But as I've been thinking about this, and thinking about Father Bill's sermon, and the remarks she made about social media and how much that facilitates fast rhetoric rather than slow rhetoric, we have to attend to the institutional environment in which discourse takes place, right? These guys met in an opportunity to see one another face to face, right? And even when the Constitutional Convention, they locked the doors, right? They were stuck with each other. They had to work this out before they left, right? And so it put a premium on sort of relationship building and being sincere and genuine as much as it was about, contending with competing perspectives. And now we have the internet, which is the context in which, and social media, the context in which most political discourse takes place in this country. And I certainly remember when the internet was in its infancy and how we were promised this was going to revolutionize democratic deliberation, right? This was going to make democratic politics possible at a level we'd never anticipated. And it's had the opposite effect, right? It's had such a destructive impact on public discourse. And it's hard for me to see how moderation could prevail again in this setting when you're rewarded for being as strident and aggressive and hostile as possible. And there are powerful commercial forces at work to perpetuate these tendencies. We have to remember that. And so, I don't know what the odds are of destroying the internet at this point, but there are times when I would go in that direction if I had.
Yeah. Well, these are all, again, just such fantastic. Now we need not just 6 additional sessions, but I think 10 additional sessions to adequately address these. Thank you for these comments and observations. Let me sort of take them in order. Moderation and passion, I think that's a very important point. Because again, as we said, why wouldn't the centrist party work? Centrists can be passionate, moderates can be passionate, but people on one side or the other of the political spectrum do have passion. It often comes across as aggression and nastiness and things like that, but there's a very clear passion there. And I think moderates, part of the moderate temperament is not so much that they're anti-passionate, but that's not what they lead with, I guess. That's not the most important element that they bring to the political discussion. And I think without passion about a particular position, particularly since so much of, if these authors are correct, and I think they are, Craiutu and Calhoun, so much of moderation is made by responding to situations, responding to other arguments, responding to the passions of politics, and then trying to knit things together and find a third way maybe, or find a creative response mechanism to that. So I think for moderates to succeed, that sort of passion question is always going to be problematic for them, because passion tends to lie, as you say, on the extremes, not so much in the middle, which is another thing that makes it harder to do. You're absolutely right, Nancy, about women's contributions, and also about these informal networks. Every single one, I think it's true of every single one that I know of. Every single one of these men had, in many cases, what we would consider very strong wives. I mean, certainly we'll talk more about the Jay family in a couple weeks. But John Jay, certainly Alexander Hamilton, Madison, I mean, all the others just had women who were wives who were tremendously powerful. And because the really successful women politically in the 1780s and 90s could not run for office, except briefly in New Jersey, could not hold office, but that did not mean they were not political. And the successful women found a way to sort of navigate the expectations of women's roles by hosting political gatherings in their own homes, in their own drawing rooms. They would gather together political figures to talk so they could meet each other and discuss informally outside of the halls of Congress, outside of the bastions of power. And so by performing traditionally accepted women's roles, they were able to, in fact, participate in politics. James Madison was a horrible politician in terms of meeting and greeting and talking to people. Dolly Madison was a genius. And James Madison enjoyed the political success he had in part because his wife was just so good. John Quincy Adams, same thing. Horrible politician. Brilliant mind, brilliant thinker, everything else. But Louisa Catherine Adams, his wife, was the great politician in that family. And there are other examples we could point to as well. And partly they achieved their political reach, not through voting, not through campaigning, but through bringing people together. And that was often a means where people could talk informally, where the stakes weren't so high, and maybe could reach solutions in that way. The last 2 points I would bring together a little bit, because I think they're both really well observed. With Barry Goldwater, the next line of that passage you quoted said, as I recall correctly, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. So he again says, if we have to be extreme, but to be moderate when there's something out there we're trying to do, that won't work either. Goldwater certainly has been seen for a long time as a harbinger of Ronald Reagan and the Reagan era and the conservatism post-1980s. But I think also there are ways in which Goldwater and that approach to politics has lived on long after he did and long after even Reagan passed from the scene as well. So I think those examples are well chosen and well drawn, and I think they suggest part of the challenge to moderation when that's being actively cultivated. And to join that with the comment also about Newt Gingrich. Gingrich is sort of the villain in a lot of the books on your reading list. When discussing what has happened to politics in the last 30 years, it's Gingrich who's often held up as the person who's ruined it all. And I say that not because he came up with that, what was the Contract with America for the 1994 midterms. That was a program of governing, and here's what we're going to be. If you vote for us, this is what we'll do, that sort of thing. That's just straightforward political communication. But the idea of we don't want people to socialize, don't shake hands with, don't play softball with Democrats, don't talk to them, don't go to concerts together, don't sip bourbon together, that sort of approach by Gingrich was sort of installed as, well, this is how we need to be. And it's that Gingrichian approach to politics, if we can call it that, that has led to the sort of persistence, I think, of that anti-moderation perspective in politics for some time. And all that has been amplified, to tie this to Troy's question, I think by internet, by social media, by those kinds of things, which reward aggression and reward hostility, reward strong takes or hot takes over thoughtful responses. I mean, when these people were giving speeches in public, as they did, it sometimes would be somebody could say something, and the person they were criticizing could take a week or so, think, sleep on it, and then come up with a thoughtful response. That sort of thing is not valued on the internet today in politics. As you say, aggression is rewarded, and it does have a very corrosive effect. So I think all these things, moderation can always be challenging. It can always be difficult in any time and era, even as it was difficult to achieve here. But I think today, for all these reasons and for all these examples, many of which in the last 30 years have been just put on steroids almost, just they're so much more powerful, even if they're not entirely new concepts. I think all those things have made moderation a challenge, and I think all those things make doing politics today really problematic. Because again, the reward is not for, here's a way we can solve a problem. The reward is, how can we stick it to the other side and rally our base and fire up our votes by humiliating our opponent? There is no reward for working together. So maybe it's, again, at the grassroots level, with local political parties, maybe those kinds of things are the way to get at that. But again, I think it's, I sort of share the pessimism that I think some of you do about how we need this, but there's so many factors working against it.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful, wonderful
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
presentation today.
This is great, thank you.
I refuse to be pessimistic, so I think that this was a demonstration of just considered, beautiful discourse around things that matter. And I'm so grateful for you, Todd. But I think the suggestion that we continue this conversation in different ways, I think this is going to be really key for us, because I don't know if you know this, but members of this parish are John and Debbie Erb, and John is the president of the Erb Family Foundation, which supports the Cranbrook Project, our nonprofit, and a lot of things. They've recently placed an emphasis in their granting on democracy. And I believe democracy begins in these settings. That's something that I think is true, and I think you all have demonstrated that today, because I know each of you really well. I know where you're from. I know what you represent, and you all are here having this conversation, and it means the world to me that each of you are here. And just in case you ever wondered, one name he mentioned, Lowell Weicker. I was Lowell Weicker's advance man when he ran for governor of Connecticut. So he and I spent hours and hours, and now you're like, oh, I thought so. I am still unaffiliated, but at the time I was the last liberal Republican in the state of Connecticut. So it was wonderful to hear that. And Lowell Weicker never ran. He was always a moderate, but yeah, he could be fiery. So without further ado, thank you again, Todd. And yes, see you.